So we're going to begin Unit 2, which is entitled Grammar Has No Future, the Verb Deep Dive. In this unit, we're going to do a deep dive into verbs and I'm going to look at how verbs are actually constructed and also look at how we deconstruct a verb to understand the mathematical formula to create a verb. We're going to use that same formula, which we call the verb expansion rule, to create a lot of other things about verbs. We're going to learn about verb moods. We're going to learn about verb tenses. We're going to learn about verb voices. And then we'll look at some weird things that happen with verbs, particularly some weird exceptions to some of our rules that we have. We'll also take a look at subject-verb agreement, which is a very common question on the SAT. So in this video, we're just going to introduce the basics of verbs and also the verb expansion rule and how we use the verb expansion rule. And then I'm going to break it down into a couple of different examples of how we actually use the verb expansion rule to create verbs, and then we'll practice that. Let's take a look at it. So this is chapter 3, which is demystifying the mysterious English verb. Verbs are weird because I think in other foreign languages, when we conjugate verbs, it's very easy to conjugate a verb. In studying Spanish, I just know that conjugating a verb in Spanish is very easy to do. But in English, it doesn't always come across that way. Sometimes it's really kind of weird the way our verbs are formed, and it seems almost illogical to us and almost mysterious. But actually, our English verb is very logical and very mathematical, and that's what we're going to discover. So when the linguists looked at our verbs and say, okay, what's going on with the English verb, we realized that a verb actually has 5 different forms to it. So let's take a look at these 5 forms. We have what we call the base form of a verb. That's a really important one. Now, eventually, we're going to call it the present tense. But the base form is sometimes referred to as the infinitive form. It's a verb that has no special ending to it at all. So like laugh or eat is the base form. We also have the S form of a verb. And so eventually we're going to call this the present singular third person. This is where we can say laughs and eats, but we can always add an S to a verb. We have the ed form of a verb, and the ed form is what we would call the past tense. And so we could say laughed or ate. We know that we don't always literally add an ed to every verb. We have some irregular ones. There's no such a word as eated. So therefore, ate is still considered the ed form. And that's going to be also true when we get to this next or the last one. We get to ing. We can add an ing to our verbs, which is what we're going to call the present participle version of the verb. And that's what give us words like laughing and eating. And lastly, we have the en form of the verb, which is what we're going to call the past participle. And that is where we'd say things like laughed or eaten. Eaten is a little easier because you can actually see the en, like words like eaten or driven have a literal en. But oftentimes they might just be end in ed, like laughed. And laughed is also the en form. But when the linguists studied the language, they realized that these 5 forms keep showing up. And they kind of looked at like why. Was there a certain reason why we use the en form? When do you use the word eaten and when did you use the word ate? When did we use the word driven and when did we use the word drove? And we realized there was an actual pattern that actually emerged. And that pattern eventually was kind of compiled into what we call an actual mathematical equation. Another thing we noticed about verbs is they sometimes came along with little buddies. And so we would call these the auxiliaries or the helping verbs. So auxiliaries or helping verbs always precede the verb, so they come in front of it. So if I said things like, the grammar teacher has eaten the donuts as bribery, has is the little helper to get us into eaten, or the cholesterol will be clogging his arteries. Well, will be are these little helpers to get us into that verb clogging. So what we notice then is that certain forms of the verb, the en verb, always had to have a buddy with him. The ing always had to have a buddy with him. So we start realizing that the ings always had to have a buddy, particularly a to be verb buddy, in order for it to work. Or the en form always had to have the verb have or has or had with it in order for it to make sense. So we start really looking at the patterns. This eventually evolved into this mathematical formula that actually every single verb follows. So we're talking about auxiliaries. It's nice to see verbs like has and will be, but remember, they're just to be helpers. They're not really the main verb. The main verb is always the last verb. So eaten and clogging is the main verb. And you can only have one main verb. So has and will be are not really the main verbs at all. They're just simply there to help the main verb. And that determines whether it's an action verb or a linking verb or a to be verb. So this eventually takes us to what we call the verb expansion rule, a really critical mathematical equation that we're going to use from the beginning all the way to the end of this little short unit. It's going to help us understand voice. It's going to help us understand a little bit of mood. It's going to help us understand really the tense of the verb as well. So it does so much. So it's really critical that we grasp it. So today we're going to take a look at how the verb expansion rule actually can deconstruct verbs and also can reconstruct verbs. So we take a predicating verb, a verb which basically creates like an action verb that creates some kind of direct object. And a predicating verb basically has typically two parts. It has an auxiliary and a main verb. Now, it doesn't have to have an auxiliary, but typically it has some kind of auxiliary and then its main verb. And then the auxiliary is kind of broken down into further parts. So the auxiliary is always based off of this thing which says T, which is going to be our way of saying tense. Then there's this other part of this formula which says M and then have plus E. It looks just like gibberish. And so don't worry about capturing this slide per se, but we're going to take this part down here in yellow and we're going to use this and kind of break down what we call this as the mathematical formula. This is the math of grammar. This is the verb expansion rule. So let me change my slide and show you what I mean by this. So the first thing is that T. T means tense. And so what that means is there's only two tenses in the English language, which is kind of mind-boggling. There's only a present and a past. There is no such thing as the future tense. It's completely made up. It's fabricated. So there's a past where we've been, and there's the present of where we are currently. But there really is no such thing as the future. The future is something that we can't measure because it hasn't happened. And by the time it does happen, it's no longer the future, it's the present. And so really the future is something that's just phony. Not to burst anyone's bubble. Next we have is this thing called M. You'll notice the M is in parentheses. We're going to find with the verb expansion rule, anything that's in parentheses is optional. So the T doesn't have parentheses because every verb has to have a tense of either present or past. But the M has parentheses. This is called a modal. And a modal is completely optional. You don't have to have these little helpers. So they oftentimes refer to them as modal auxiliaries. Just refer to them as a modal. So a modal always shows up in a little pair. It has a present and a past form, except the last two. So there's will and would, present and past, shall and should, present and past, can and could, present and past, may and might, present and past. And the last two are only in present tense, must, ought to. They're two separate ones. Must is not the present or the past of ought to. They're completely separate verbs. There is no past tense of must, and there's no past tense of ought to. But these are your modals, and once again, they're optional. You don't have to have them. But modals basically are going to create mood for us. They're going to create for us what we call the indicative, the conditional, the subjunctive, and the emphatic moods. And that's what a modal will do for us. Then we have this next part which says have plus en. Have plus en, once again, is optional, but we're going to find it shows up as a pair. So every time we have the verb have or a form of the verb have, like has or had, en seems to travel with it. Same thing happens in the next little grouping, be plus ing. When I see a be or a be verb, the ing is always going to travel with it. And so they always come as a pair. But once again, there's parentheses around it, which means they're not really always necessary. But if you are going to use one, the other one has to travel with it. And lastly, you see this thing that says MV. MV simply stands for main verb. So if you think about the verb expansion rule, and I'll see if I can bring my little highlighter up here for everybody, is you have to have a tense and you have to have a main verb. Those two things are essential. In between here, these three parts are completely optional. But when we build the verb expansion rule and we actually take apart a verb, as we're going to do next, is we're simply going to work our way down logically from the beginning all the way to the end, and we're simply going to show how these parts create all the verbs in the English language. So if I took a sentence like, I have hidden the donuts from you, and I take this verb have hidden, I can take the verb have hidden and I can change it into the verb expansion rule and show how logically have hidden is created using this mathematical formula. I'm going to use this as well as three other examples to kind of break down, and I encourage you to write them down as sort of examples of how we use the verb expansion rule. We're going to first deconstruct verbs, meaning we're going to take have hidden and deconstruct it into a mathematical equation, and then we're going to reconstruct it. We're going to take a mathematical equation and add it together to create a final verb. So it's kind of like doing math. It's taking the answer and breaking it down, and then taking something that's been sort of strung out and then gluing it all back together to a final answer. So we'll do this 4 times as practice before we jump into some overall practice on a worksheet today.